Hello and welcome to the Knights of the Nightmare Let's Play. This is video recap number 2. The previous video recap covered the characters we've met so far in the game. The intent of this video is to cover in chronological order the flashbacks we've seen. So basically the chain of events that led up to the game beginning. I'm subject to error, of course, as we all know, so it's possible I might have gotten these in the wrong order, but I think for the most part I do have them occurring the way they do in the story. We'll find out though. Before we actually get to that though, there was another thing I wanted to address, and that is basically the general flow of the game. I touched on this briefly in the previous video, but let's hammer it home here and make sure everyone's on the same page. So typically in the beginning of a stage we'll get a cutscene, and this cutscene as you can see, it's in color, so we know that yes, it's in chronological order, it's happening in real time, it's happening now with the story. And it typically involves what's happening right up before the fight. So we're seeing a howling voice saying grr, and that happens to be the werewolf in this example I've chosen. After that, then there's basically a slideshow of the Knights' banners, and this seems to be randomized depending on which order pops up. Anyway, we're also addressed by a narrator, and this narrator, I might not be correct on this, but my take on this narrator is that it's not really an entity, it's the game itself addressing us, the player, and explaining what's going on. At any rate, it'll usually fill us in on what's going on with the battle, and also it'll fill us in with some world-building details, so there'll be times when, for example, in the previous video I mentioned that the kingdom is in decay. Well, I know that because this narrator here told me so in one of the pre-battle slideshow things. After that, then we get the scene, the title of the scene. So here we are, Werewolf's Territory, Scene 4. Following that, we're given yet another cutscene, which plays in color, so of course it's in chronological order. Usually it's with the Wisp addressing who he's about to kill. And then at the top screen we get a description of where we're fighting at. And this gives us some details that we might not necessarily get otherwise, so it's good to pay attention to these if you're interested in that. But otherwise they also help with the world building details. Once that plays out, then at the bottom screen we're addressed again with a narrator. Now, it is my opinion that this second narrator is a completely different entity than the first one, and it actually is an entity in the game. This particular narrator is followed with a distinct sound, so you know this narrator when you hear it. I'm not sure how to address this. I'm going to try and be as vague as possible, but this narrator is indeed a character, and eventually we will learn who this narrator is in a fashion. But ultimately this narrator doesn't have any consequence to the story itself. I'll try and leave it like that, and you guys will see what I mean eventually, hopefully. Alright, after this distinct narrator with the distinct sound accompanying the voice of the narrator, after this narrator finishes talking, then it's time to start the battle. So that leads us, of course, to the preparation screen where we can check the lay of the land, we can assign our weapons, we can figure out what key items to pick up, you know, that sort of thing. Then after that, we actually begin the game itself. We fight our fight. This is a boss battle, so we have to actually kill the creature before we can move on. In the other stages, what I have to do is, of course, fill out the monster matrix at the bottom of the screen, which is not visible here. At the end, we win the fight, and we get another cutscene in which the person or creatures we've just finished off address us one last time. In most cases, it's a monster saying, "Oh, I shouldn't have picked that fight," or something along those lines. In this case, the werewolf actually addresses us, and if you recall, he actually recognizes us as his father. We are the king, of course, we're the dead king, and the werewolf was the prince. So upon his death, he realizes, oh shit, that's dad, and he keels over dead. After this cutscene, then we're addressed again with the distinct narrator with this distinct sound effect. And typically this narrator is asking questions of the king. So in this case, the narrator's asking, what is it that appeared before you when the beast was defeated? What was that? Of course, we, as the players, understand, yeah, that was his son, but the narrator's pointing that out to us. Once that's finished, then we're given our score for the round, and we're notified of any knights that joined up with us. So in this case, Dreas, our archer, joined us. Following that, we're given a flashback, and the flashbacks are kind of a mixed bag. They happen in scrambled order, so you have to kind of figure out what flashback happens when. But they do give us a distinct time, so here you can see late night, 8 days before the attack on Regniberg. And it also gives us a distinct location, so this happens in southern Vald, as you can see from the bottom screen. I didn't take a screenshot, but once again, before the flashback actually begins, we are addressed by that distinct narrator. So the distinct sound effect and the distinct narrator speak again, and fills us in a little bit on what's happening. After the flashback, then we're given the opportunity to save, and if you notice at the top, the game is still referring to this as Scene 4. So we're still in Chapter 4, Scene 4 at this point. You can save or else you can decline, doesn't matter. And then you move on to the organization screen. So you can dink around with your inventory or level up your guys or whatever you need to get done. Once you're finished with this inventory screen, you're given another opportunity to save. And then once you've done that, then the game rolls over and now all of a sudden we're in Scene 5. So the game considers that the end of Scene 4 and now we've begun the next scene. And then, sure enough, the next scene begins with another in-color cutscene in chronological order. In this case, these knights have found the corpse of the werewolf that we just killed. So, yep, sure enough, these happen in order. There's also intermixed with these cutscenes, there can be another cutscene that's set in a completely different place with different characters that are advancing the story for, say, the bad guys or whatever. But we can assume that that's happening at the same time as these other cutscenes that we're seeing in color. So, just as a quick review, this will be quick and dirty, but the general flow is a cutscene, then we play the game, we get a flashback, there's a save point, we can fart around with our inventory, and at that point the game considers that, okay, that's the stage. So stage 4 had those sections, and then we got to the cutoff point, and then stage 5 continued on the same manner. Now, this may be a little confusing to viewers of these videos because the way I cut these videos up, it's actually the way it's represented here with the green box. So, we watched the cutscene of stage 4, we watched that in the previous video, and then it ended, and then the stage 4 video proper started with the gameplay. Then, of course, we saw the flashback, the save point, I messed around with the inventory, then we saw the cutscene for stage 5. At that point, the video ends. The reason why I do that is because in the event that someone wants to only watch the gameplay, they don't care about the story, I want to front load the videos with that. And then if you want to hang around later and watch the story, then that's okay. So it's basically intended to be a convenience thing. Alright, having said all that, let's get started. As I've said, I've tried to put in chronological order the flashbacks we've seen. I hope I did it right. I think I'm fairly close. At any rate, let's get started. So, as you can see, chronologically, as far as I can tell, the first flashback is set one night before the fall of the Western Tower. Now, this is the only mention so far we've had in the game of a fall of a Western Tower. So, it's only occurred up this one time. However, I do have a reason to believe that this is chronologically the first thing that happened, and I'll get to that. During the flashback, that distinct narrator once again talks to us and describes it as, this was still autumn, and the castle had not yet faced disaster. So we know this is before the fall of the king, before he was killed at the tragedy of Eventhium Castle, and it's set in the autumn, so okay, it's fall, sure. This flashback concerns Moira, who is our permanent hermit, and Bon, who's a warrior that we ended up transsoling. I think we transsold him to Moira, actually. At any rate, it's set in Northwest Vald, so here is our disgusting map, and I guess that'd be Northwest Vald, right around there. So anyway, the cutscene begins with Moira saying, "Oh, I hear the king is coming this way." Now, if you notice, the knights are not mentioned in these cutscenes, or these flashbacks. It's very rare that they're named. So we're forced to use the portrait to identify who it is. In this case, Moira is being called the Cool-Eyed Officer. So it gives you just a little snippet of their personality, I suppose, with the description they're given. Anyway, she says, yep, hey, I hear the king's coming, and we might hear some news about the capital. And remember, the capital is Regniberg, that port town, the big yellow blob on the map. To this, Bond responds with, hey, we might be able to get some booze too, ha ha ha. So, I want to call to attention here that this was set in the autumn, as I mentioned, in the Vald Forest. Now, in the Werewolf's Territory pre-scene thing where it described the location, as we discussed earlier, there's a distinct thing mentioned here. If you look in the text here, it says, the flowers blooming here are telling reminders of spring's approach. So remember, this is actually in the real time, this is the current time, so we know, as far as the game is concerned, when we're playing it, spring is on its way, so we're at the end of winter. And we also know that this particular flashback that we're discussing now happened in autumn. So we have a kind of a vague timeline started here. Moving on, the next flashback that we have is set 4 nights before the princess to be wed. This flashback concerns Erica, Francis, and Bailey. And it's set in northern Regniberg, so I guess, there, that looks good. Sure, there. At any rate, it begins with the pale-haired officer, aka Erica, saying, hey, I got some gossip. Did you know that our prince is going to be engaged? And it's none other than Princess Alier that he's engaged to. Can you believe that? Now remember, Princess Alier is the princess of the Tiamats, which is another race that lives in this world. And the Tiamats are in a feud with the Glevnir Kingdom. And actually, the Tiamats are on the losing end of the feud. They've been on the outs and have been ostracized and marginalized for generations. The game itself has told us that the king wanted to make a blood tie between his people and the Tiamats. And so it appears this is his method. He wanted to betroth his son, the prince, with the princess of the Tiamats. Francis speaks up and says, well, if the rumors are true, she's beautiful. When he hears that, then Bailey pipes in and says, I don't agree that she's beautiful. She has those horns and those wings. So at this point we learn, okay, the Tiamats are physically different than the Glevnir Kingdom citizens, who I'm just going to go ahead and call them humans. I don't know if that's what they are or not, but we'll go with humans. At any rate, the Tiamats presumably will be easy to spot because they have horns and wings. Despite that, though, she's apparently considered quite gorgeous. Erica continues the conversation saying, well, maybe if they're related, the families are related, then they'll stop feuding. So this might be an end to the feud, which of course seems to be the point of why they would be getting married in the first place. Francis continues the thought and says, well, gosh, they could lead both nations together if this goes well. So, I'm taking away from this the general idea of these two getting married, the prince and princess, is pretty well received by the populace. They're looking forward to it. Yeah, they're like, hey, we could end the feud. That's a good thing. This is pretty much the only time we've shown the population's reaction to this announcement. So, seeing as this is what the developers chose to show us, I'm going to say, okay, the general consensus is, okay, this is good news. We're happy for it. Now, I want to remind you that Prince Nordich, of course, being the son of King Wilmgard, we've not seen him in his human form in the game. We've seen him as the werewolf. Anyway, he had a thing going with Peach, who was the granddaughter of the Cardinal. So, they have some kind of relationship going on, but now Prince Nordich is engaged to Princess Alier of the Tiamats. So, as you can see, there's some kind of a triangle going on, and it's kind of a funny thing, because ultimately it doesn't matter anymore anyway, does it? The prince is dead. We killed him ourselves when he was the werewolf. So, it's kind of a behind-the-scenes little triangle that was going on that ultimately doesn't mean much, but if you're willing to delve into the plot, you'll pick up on things like this. It's kind of neat. Alright, let's move on. The next event that we have is set 7 nights before the tragedy of Aventhium Castle. And remember, Aventhium Castle is where, of course, the king lives, I would expect. And the tragedy at Aventhium Castle, we know for a fact that's when the king died. So now we're 7 nights before the king dies. This flashback is set in Regniberg, so alright, there you go, someplace in there. At any rate, the distinct narrator once again talks before the flashback and says, as soon as the castle learned of the threat on the opposite shore, many knights were ordered from the castle to cross the lake and begin defensive preparations. However, the knights only found peace on the eastern side of the lake. So there was some news apparently that something bad was going to go down on the eastern border. and so all the knights left the castle to go try and fortify it, but when they got there seemed to be no problems. The flashback opens with Alonso, who's our lance knight. He's described here as formidable knight. Anyway, he's asking his lackeys, "How was it? Did you cover any information?" And a young scout says, "Yes, sir, but there really isn't any problem." As an aside, I want to point out this young scout's portrait is a generic knight portrait. So if there's a knight that is not recruitable, does not become part of our roster, then they're given a generic portrait. This one's one of the generic archer portraits. There's a couple of them, but it pays to recognize these once you're doing the flashbacks. You can understand, well, that's just some random dude. It's not an important knight. Anyway, he goes on to say, well, the citizens of the East, they say there's no problems. Then a worried adjutant, whose name is Karina, we have not recruited her yet. I don't know if we can or not. But anyway, at any rate, she says, well, the intelligencers told us that citizens needed help, so what's going on? Yet another knight comes up. This is Rolenta, hermit, and she says, well, I spoke with the guard garrison myself, and they're not aware of anything wrong, so no one knows what's going on. To this, Alonso kind of thinks to himself, well, this is strange. I hope this is a mistake by the leaders. Then he turns to his troops and says something that kind of sounds weird to me. He says, the Second Order gave us this information. We trust them. Well, that always struck me as strange because, I would hope that you would trust them. I mean, you're all part of the same kingdom, right? So this is an interesting line. It certainly sows the seed that I guess there's some mistrust going on, I guess. At that point, Karina responds, well, I wonder where Gunther got this information. We're going to take a moment to talk about General Gunther. I didn't cover him in the last video, which was with the characters, because he hadn't really come up yet. However, we have seen a flashback in which he was in, so I figured I guess I'll cover it now. So there he is, that's his portrait, that's Sir Gunther. He is the head of the Second Order of Knights. Now, who are the Second Order of Knights? They're actually a pretty prominent order, or an important order I should say. I'm going to read from the Tome of Lost Souls, which is the pre-order bonus book that came with the game. There's a description of the Second Order inside that says, led by Grand Marshal Gunther, this order is the kingdom's main armed force. Their numbers and spirits are high, and they are headquartered in Fort Gerhard, a strategic defense point for the kingdom. If enemies were to attack the kingdom, they would have to face this heavily defensive wall first. So they're pretty much the first order of defense for the kingdom. As I mentioned, they're headed by Sir Gunther. They're the main armed force. And yep, they're stationed at Fort Gerhard, which is right here on our gross map. I want to point out, in the game itself, this is where we are in the game right now. We're at Fort Gerhard. At any rate, Sir Gunther himself, he heads the Second Order. I've said that about 10 times now. He also founded the 11th Order of Knights. So, wait, who are the 11th Order? Well, there's their banner, and they are made of young, inexperienced knights. I'm going to read again from the book, and let's see what it says about them. As far as the 11th Order is concerned, a sort of backup force led by the young Captain Rolf. Few of the troops have experience in real battle, and this unit stays in the peaceful eastern regions. This group was originally founded by Grand Marshal Gunther, and he routinely assigns them to peacekeeping duty near Lake Noir and the surrounding towns. So, as far as the 11th Order Knights are concerned, we can probably assume that they'll generally be in this typical region here, in the eastern regions. Another thing that's mentioned in the Tome of Lost Souls in part of the intro is that it's generally well known in this kingdom that the further west you go, the more conflicted the land becomes. So, the conflict increases as the further west you go. Now, there has been mention very briefly of the Westkin. In one of the flashbacks, someone randomly in passing mentioned the Westkin. We don't know anything else about them. However, we do know, presumably, I think it's safe to say that they must live in the West. And we know that the West is conflicted. So, we'll make the assumption right now that the Westkin are not friendly. Furthermore, do you remember the very first flashback we looked at? It concerned the night before the fall of the Western Tower. So, there's apparently a tower to the west, and whether it's because of the conflict that happened there or something else, it fell over. So there's certainly a lot going on in the west. Primarily we've been dealing only with the eastern portion of the map. I have a feeling before the game ends we'll find our way to the west. Anyway, back to Sir Gunther. I guess before we get to him, I want to point out that as far as the 11th Order is concerned, a great majority of the knights we've recruited so far were from the 11th Order. For example, Johann, the very first guy we ever recruited, he's from the 11th Order. Same with Moira, our permanent hermit, Bon, the warrior, Andreas, our archer, Alonso, our lance knight. All these guys are members of the 11th Order. In fact, if you look in the Vald Forest, this abandoned church is where we actually began the game. So the very first stage of the game was in this abandoned church, and you may remember that's where we saw Johann die. So he was stationed there when we began the game, or excuse me, before we began the game. At any rate, back to the current flashback. Karina is wondering where did Gunther get this information from, and it just kind of ends there. So, on a mysterious note, why was there intelligence telling them to fortify the east? Why were people drawn away from the castle? Sounds a little suspicious, doesn't it? Alright, that wraps up that flashback. Let's go to the next. So, the very next major event that we see is set 4 nights before the tragedy of Aventhium Castle. It's set in Regniberg, so the same place we were just at. And in this flashback, we see Krosef, who is a lance knight, wondering out loud, what is keeping the messengers? So they've been sending out messengers, but getting no response back. And it's happened several times now. Lillian, a duelist, mentions, I can't help but think that someone is interfering. And to this, Krosef responds, we're being isolated from anyone who can direct us. So, kind of a short flashback, but a chilling one. The knights are kind of piecing together here. Well, all of us have been stationed away from the castle, and now we can't communicate with anyone else. So there's something going on. The next flashback we have is set the night before the tragedy of Aventhium Castle. So, the night before. During this flashback, that distinct narrator addresses us and says that before the Lionheart King's death, he was inspecting the various territories in the kingdom and ending his tour with Fort Gerhard. He also goes on to mention that the people's hearts and minds were cheered by the appearance of the king, and the knights' morale was lifted immensely. So we can tell, for one thing, that the king had been not in the castle, he'd been out in the kingdom, checking the territories. And also, it seems as though he's held in pretty high regard with the populace. If he can lift the morale just by appearing, then I guess I'm going to take that as a sign that they like him, they like the guy. Now, if you recall from the very first flashback we looked at, set in the Vald Forest, this was the night before the fall of the Western Tower, whenever that was. But during this flashback, Moira mentions, I hear the king himself is leading the army this way. So now we know, okay, this was set in the autumn, remember that flashback, and the king was touring around the kingdom, inspecting for monsters. And so we know, okay, during that first flashback, that's where he was. And we also know the end of this little tour he had ended with Fort Gerhard, which of course is in the center of the map, at the end of Dussel Bridge, right there. And I've said this before, but I want to point out that's where we are in the game right now. We're at Fort Gerhard. So, the night before the tragedy of Aventhium Castle, the king manages to get back to Fort Gerhard, wrapping up his tour of the kingdom. The flashback begins with the king basically giving kind of a lecture and saying, yep, we should prepare for the worst. Yep, you have to take care of the people. Yep, etc., etc. And then we see for the first time there's Sir Gunther, and he's described as a loyal officer, and says, yep, alright, I agree with you. At that point, a generic knight runs in and says, the cardinal wants you to return to the castle, king, you better get going. And the king says, oh gosh, yep, I guess I better go, if it must be serious, so he leaves. Now, this is the night before the tragedy of Aventhium Castle. The next day, the tragedy occurs, so of course the king is going off to his death without realizing it. So the next major event, obviously, is the tragedy at Aventhium Castle when the king dies. We don't know what else happens very much. We have a vague clue, but we don't really know the specifics of what happened that night. The next flashback we have is one day after the tragedy of Aventhium Castle. This flashback concerns Martin, Rolf, and Michel. Once again, that distinct narrator speaks to us and says that There's been odd incidents beginning to occur across the kingdom. Everyone recognized the ominous symptoms in the forest. Knights searching for their lost comrades noticed the impending changes in the far-off reaches of the kingdom. So, once again, this is set one day after the tragedy of Aventhium Castle. However, it's not as though everyone instantly knows, oh, the king's dead, and no one knows that yet. In fact, there has been interference with the messengers, so it's pretty clear that no one knows at all. It's a pretty well kept secret, I suppose, at this point. However, the knights have noticed that, well, there's something in the air. It's getting kind of crappy here. So, here we go. This flashback concerns Michel, who washed ashore in the forest. So, Martin and Rolf were off searching for missing knights, and they stumbled upon Michel. Now, true story. I don't know if you've realized this, but each of these slides is basically an image I have to make in Photoshop, and so I make image after image, and I get through it. Got to the end of it, made all the images, started working through how I was going to present it, and realized, wait, oh shit, I forgot this flashback. I didn't make any images for this flashback. I guess I better stick it in. I thought about it a little bit and thought, well, no, I mean, we covered this flashback in one of the previous videos. It's fine. Thought about that for a little bit and then decided, no, the whole point of this is a recap, so no one needs to be in here to remind people. So, this is the very last set of images I had to make for this. I was all set and ready to go until I made this set of images. And then I found a problem. So, if you notice, the location given here, the bottom screen is Northeast Vald. So, Michel washed ashore from the lake and ended up in Northeast Vald. So that would put him, I guess, somewhere around here. So, he washed from the lake. He washed all the way over there. Fuck. Okay. Shit. Alright, so there's clearly a problem with my map. My map sucks. It was a bad idea to draw a map. I'm a dumb idiot. I should never have tried to do it. Fuck. I don't know how accurate this piece of shit is anymore. Fuck me. You were all fools to believe me. Fuck me. The map's fucked. Okay, so let's try and fix this if we can. I racked my brain, and I'm not a cartographer, I'm not an artist, I'm just a moron. Anyway, the best I could come up with is maybe the map looks more like this, I guess, I don't know. And you could call that Northeast Vald. I'd really struggle with calling that Northeast Vald. I think it looks like crap. I might be drawing it that top part might be going too far to the left, but this would make a bit more sense with the direction we've taken in the game, the path we've taken as we played the game. Chapter 1, or Scene 1 starts there, so that would make the abandoned church in that area. 2 is there in the deep Vald. 3 is in Northeast Vald. 4, where we fight the werewolf, that was set in the deep South Vald. And then finally, 5 is North Regniburg. So, I mean, that makes sense. That'd be a logical path we would take. It does make sense more than my current map, which would have the path be more like, there we go. So, fuck. I don't know. This might be correct. I still really struggle with calling that location Northeast Vald. I think that can't be right. So there's even more problems with this fucking map. Sorry guys, as I said, this was the last thing I noticed before I even started doing these videos, so all the maps are going to be the incorrect version. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to matter a tremendous amount. It's just really annoying, and I'm sorry about it. I apologize. I should have known better than to try to do a fucking map, but I didn't know better, and so now we're stuck with this incorrect map. So I'll be sure to point it out when it comes up. For what it's worth, I think the Vald Forest is the only incorrect part. At least that's the only thing I'm aware of now as being incorrect. So I think Regniburg, Dusselbridge, Revulia's location, Fort Gerhard, and the castle, I think those are all relatively correct still. Anyway, fucking hell. Moving on. So, in the Northeast Vald, you know what, maybe that's a typo too, I don't know. Anyway, Northeast Vald, they find Michel. In fact, Martin finds him unconscious laying there. Martin says something which I thought was kind of interesting. This is the emblem of Sir Vishna's 8th Order. Well, first things first, the last video, Vishna's name came up, and I said that she was not a very important knight. That was wrong. I mean, she's the head of the 8th Order, so surely she's important. The 8th Order of Knights is stationed in the castle. But another thing that I found interesting is they didn't recognize Michel. They can only tell from his emblem where he came from. Which, to me, that kind of surprised me, because I figured, well, this is a small kingdom. I guess I assumed everyone just kind of knew everyone else. But apparently that's not true. So take that to heart, I guess. So Rolf concludes, well, if he's from the 8th Order, then he floated over here from the Lake Noir, I guess. At that point, Michel wakes up and stands up, and he gets questioned by Martin, who asks him, you know, hey, what happened? What happened to the castle? Of course, Michel has amnesia. He can't remember. The only thing he can stammer out is that the monsters came. Alright, that concludes that flashback. The next one we have is set one night after the tragedy at Aventium Castle. Remember, the previous one was one day, and then the night after, then this current flashback happened. And that's when we see for ourselves Revulia, the monster, touch down on Dussel Bridge and starts guarding Fort Gerhard. So she touches down, she kills everyone standing around. The next flashback is 3 nights after the tragedy at Aventium Castle, in which case a generic knight says, no, there's a monster there, we won't stand a chance, and they get wiped out as well. The next flashback is 5 days after the tragedy, and we're still on Dussel Bridge, and so many are lost from all the cadets we had here, so what they're driving here is that it's just a slaughter. Revulia is planted on the bridge. She's a very intentional roadblock. She prevents any messengers from getting out, and she's just slaughtering everyone. I really didn't do this justice because the flashbacks really drive home that it's just this merciless slaughter. As the knights are getting cut down, it's just a bloodbath. We do get some characterization from some of the generic knights. It's kind of touching because in most cases they say something like, you know, if I'm going down fighting, and they rush in, or else they're trying to rescue their friends and they get killed or whatever. It's pretty brutal. In fact, if you watch these flashbacks back to back like this in the proper order, then yeah, it's a little bit of a downer, let's put it that way. So this is days and days after the king's been dead, and there's been no messengers that have been able to get to the castle. So by rights, the rest of the kingdom doesn't even know what's going on yet. Finally, 5 days after the tragedy of Aventium Castle, one lone lance knight gets out, Annelot. She gets out and she rushes to Regniberg, Carlane, which is a residential district. And she finally tells the knights there Aventium's been attacked, which is shocking news to them. They had no idea. She goes on to say, and the king's dead, which of course that just knocked them off their feet. The only clue we have of what actually happened during the tragedy is her saying that an army of monsters appeared out of nowhere. So presumably they portaled in or they warped in and they just slaughtered everybody. At this point, Annelot collapses, and I think we're led to believe that she dies from her wounds, but I don't know that for a fact. And that's finally, you know, it's been 5 nights, and finally the rest of the kingdom knows, oh holy shit, the king's dead. Okay, the next flashback chronologically we have is 8 days before the attack on Regniberg. This is kind of a hard one to place, but I do know that we just saw Annelot go to Regniberg and tell her knights friends that the king was dead. So I know Regniberg was still standing at that point. I also know that during the gameplay, Regniberg has fallen because we're traveling through Regniberg, and we have traveled through it, and it's just filled with monsters. So I know that between those 2 events, that's when the fall of Regniberg happens. Anyway, the description is basically they were looking for the werewolf because there's some werewolf prowling around in the forest and they wanted to track it down. Firenze and Andreas were both looking together as partners, and they get jumped by the werewolf. Firenze says, oh, get out of here, kid, I'll hold him off, or whatever. But he gets cut down almost immediately, and then Andreas, being a kid, he gets slaughtered, just like that. Then the next flashback we see is midnight, 1 day before the attack on Regniberg. And this is actually the very first flashback we ever saw in the game, in which Johann is killed. So Johann is relieving his buddies at the abandoned church, saying, hey, it's my turn to watch, you can go get some grub. But he actually discovers monsters and he's killed. It didn't seem to stand much of a chance either. Alright guys, to my knowledge that is the chain of events for these flashbacks. We've only seen so many flashbacks, of course. We've gotten one flashback per stage, and we've only done 14 stages, so there's more to come. But to my knowledge, this is the correct order in which things happened up until the start of the game. There'll be more flashbacks to come, so there'll be more mysteries to solve. But as for now, I think that'll do. Next video will cover all the events that happened once the game began. So all of the in-color cutscenes describing the events of the game as they happened. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.